What if I told you that some of the bravest warriors in the Bible bled in silence, wept in hidden places, and still dared to rise? Not because they were fearless, but because they were faithful. When I was 27, I sat across from a supervisor who looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're smart, but don't be too loud about it." I laughed in the moment because that's what you do when someone says something that feels like a compliment laced with warning. But something in me shrunk that day. I walked out of that meeting with a little less voice, a little less light. I started second-guessing how often I raised my hand, how confident I sounded when I knew the answer, how much space I took up in a room full of people who looked like they'd already decided what I should be. That's the thing about the world. It has a way of rewarding us for being agreeable, for being small, for staying in our lane, especially if you're a woman, especially if you're different, especially if you're not what they expected. And that's why Esther's story cracks something wide open in me every single time I read it. We know the highlight reel version of her life. A beautiful woman becomes queen and saves her people. But if we actually slow down and sit with her story, what we find isn't a fairy tale. It's a woman thrown into a life she didn't choose, hiding who she really was, trying to survive in a palace that never truly belonged to her. She wasn't marching in with a 5-point plan to rescue anyone. She was quiet, she was unsure, she was tucked away, carrying a secret that could get her killed, until the moment came when she had to decide, would she risk everything, even her life, for something bigger than herself? And here's where the story shifts, not because Esther felt fearless, but because she realized the risk of staying silent was greater than the fear of speaking out. We often romanticize courage, imagining it as bold, loud, flashy, but more often than not, it looks like what Esther did. Trembling in the hallway, heart pounding, walking toward a door that might end it all. And walking anyway. Her famous words, "If I perish, I perish," weren't defiance. They were surrender. They were the most honest prayer of a woman who had no guarantees, no assurance of outcome, but chose to show up anyway. And you know what? That's the moment I come back to every time I feel like my voice is too much, or not enough, or too messy, or too inconvenient. When I feel like shrinking to make others comfortable. Esther reminds me that obedience often starts with fear. That courage is built in the moment we decide to act while still afraid. Psychologists call it anticipatory anxiety, that wave of physical discomfort that shows up before something brave. Second Summit by Matt Kine, Psychic Esther. I recommend this book to anyone I know. It's also a personal favorite. That wave of physical discomfort that shows up before something breaks. It's our body trying to protect us from risk, from humiliation, from loss. It's natural, it's human. It means your system is working. But what we do next, that's where courage is born. And here's what I want to say to the woman who's listening and wondering if she should keep playing small. Your voice might not feel like much right now. You might feel like you're standing in a palace that's not really yours, in a role you never asked for, and a life that feels bigger than your bravery. But what if, just what if, you were made for such a time as this? What if the exact place that scares you the most is the place you've been positioned for redemption? And what if your trembling steps are more powerful than someone else's loud, polished certainty? Sometimes God doesn't ask you to feel brave. He asks you to show up while your knees are shaking. That's the kind of courage that changes history. That's the kind of courage that lives in you, just like Esther. Have you ever felt like someone only wanted you for what you could give, and once they got it, you became disposable? I have. There was a season in my life where I gave my all to someone, a relationship that I thought was built on something real, something mutual. I poured out my time, my energy, my loyalty. I kept showing up, even when the emotional return was a fraction of the investment. And when they no longer needed me, they walked away like I never existed. No explanation, no apology, just absence. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, hoping for a text that would never come. The silence was deafening. I wasn't just grieving the loss of the relationship, I was grieving the loss of meaning, the feeling that maybe I was only ever valued for what I offered, not for who I was. I remember crying, just part of that feeling. I was grieving the feeling that I didn't mean much. And this is where I started. I was grieving the loss of the relationship. I was grieving the loss of the relationship. I was grieving the loss of who I was. That's why Hagar's story cuts so deep. We rarely tell her story from her perspective. She's often treated as a side note in Abraham and Sarah's legacy, a name mentioned briefly before the focus shifts to someone more important. But when I read her story, as a woman who has felt used, abandoned, and unseen, I see her. Hagar didn't ask to be brought into Abraham's tent. She didn't ask to bear a child for someone else's dream. She didn't have the power to say no. She was a servant, a foreigner, a woman with no voice in a world run by others. And when things got complicated, when Sarah's jealousy took over and the situation became too messy, Hagar was cast out, pregnant, alone, rejected. Can you imagine that kind of exile? To be pushed out of a home you never chose, carrying a child that wasn't even your idea, walking into a wilderness with nothing but pain in your chest and sand under your feet? But here's where the story turns, so gently and yet so powerfully. In the wilderness, where no one else came looking for her, God found her. Not Abraham, not Sarah, not a friend. God. And he didn't just speak to her, he called her by name. That detail might seem small, but it's everything. Because when you've been treated like a tool, when you've been silenced, when you've been discarded like a broken thing, hearing your name is holy. Psychologists talk about the trauma of invisibility. It's not just about being alone, it's about being unseen, living in a world that acts like you don't exist unless you're useful. Social abandonment, as experts like Stephen Porges explain, triggers our deepest survival panic because it tells our nervous system we don't belong, we're not safe, we're not worth saving. But Hagar's story interrupts that lie. When no one else cared, God did. When no one else noticed, he saw. And when no one else called her worthy, he gave her a future. And what does Hagar do? She gives God a name. El Roy, the God who sees me, not the God of rules, not the God of distant holiness, the God who sees me. And that moment, that encounter, it reshaped her. Because once you've been truly seen, you can't go back to believing you're invisible. I want to say this to the woman who feels like her value was conditional, based on how pretty she looked, how well she performed, how quiet she stayed, how much she sacrificed. You are not disposable. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. The God who saw Hagar in the wilderness sees you in yours. And maybe you've been rejected. But sometimes rejection is the mercy that moves you out of a place that was never safe for your soul. You may feel invisible to the world, but heaven has never taken its eyes off you. That's not just comfort. That's truth. That's Hagar's story. And maybe it's yours too. And maybe It's yours too. There was a season in my life when I didn't want to be healed. I just wanted to be held. I didn't want someone to fix me, I just wanted someone to see me. I wanted to walk into a room and not feel like my shame entered before I did. I wanted to stop performing worthiness and just be enough. I think about that when I read about the woman with the issue of blood. Her story is just a few verses long, but it holds more pain, silence, and quiet courage than some entire biographies. She had been bleeding for 12 years. That's over a decade of being unclean, unwanted, untouched. In her culture, her condition meant she couldn't enter the temple. She couldn't sit with others. She couldn't be embraced without making someone else unclean. That kind of isolation breaks a person in layers. Can you imagine waking up every day for 4,380 mornings and knowing that no one will look you in the eyes without judgment? And so she had to work through and personally, in one way, create a safe place, knowing that even the people who once cared have long stopped checking in, that your suffering has become your identity. The Bible says she spent everything she had on doctors, but instead of healing, she only grew worse. And so, one day, broken and bleeding and desperate, she slips through the crowd, not announcing herself, not asking for attention, not making a scene. She doesn't even try to touch Jesus' hand or face. She just reaches out for the edge of his garment, just the hem, because sometimes that's all the strength you have left. Not to pray out loud, not to give a speech, just to reach. That moment undoes me. Because we live in a world where we're constantly told to be strong, keep your head up, fake it till you make it. But what if all your strength is used up just getting out of bed? What if the bravest thing you did today was not give up? According to shame researcher Dr. Brené Brown, shame is the intensely painful belief that we are unworthy of love and belonging. And this woman had been living in that emotional space for 12 years, not just bleeding physically, but bleeding shame. What moves me most is what Jesus does. He doesn't just heal her body. He stops. He looks for her. Can we sit with that for a moment? In a crowd pressing in from all sides with people shouting and grabbing and pushing, he feels her touch. And instead of brushing it off, he wants to know who she is. Because Jesus didn't come just to fix symptoms. He came to restore souls. When she finally steps forward, afraid and trembling, she tells him the whole truth, every ugly, painful, humiliating detail. And instead of turning away, he calls her daughter. Not woman, not outcast, daughter. That word changes everything because it doesn't just say, you're healed. It says, you belong. This wasn't a transaction, it was a transformation. I think of how many of us walk around hoping no one notices our limp, hoping our scars don't show, hoping we can hide the bleeding long enough to pass for normal. But healing never comes from hiding. And shame dies in the light of being fully seen and fully loved. Maybe today you're not ready for a full revival. Maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you just need to reach for the hem. That's enough. That's faith. That's all it took. You don't have to shout. You don't have to be bold. You don't have to impress God with your strength. You just have to be willing to reach right there in your pain. You are not too broken. You are exactly the kind of broken that God loves to touch. That's what this woman's story tells us. That even after 12 years of silence, a single moment of reaching can rewrite the whole narrative. And if that was true for her, it can be true for you too. I remember a winter in my life when everything that made me feel safe fell apart. I lost a job that had become part of my identity. A close friendship ended quietly and without closure. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't recognize my own reflection, not just in the mirror, but in the way I moved through the world. I wasn't the confident woman I had worked so hard to become. I felt like I was walking through fog, stripped of certainty, of status, of direction. And here's what no one tells you about losing everything. It's not just the loss that breaks you. It's the stillness that follows. It's the questions echoing in that silence. Who am I now? What's left of me if everything familiar is gone? What if I'm just empty? That's why Ruth's story doesn't just inspire me, it grounds me. When we first meet her, she's not strong. She's not preaching hope. She's grieving. She's a widow in a foreign land with no future, no plan, and no promise. Her entire identity, wife, daughter-in-law, Moabite, had unraveled. And yet, in the middle of that unraveling, she speaks one of the most radical, soul-rooted commitments in the entire Bible. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. And your God, I will be free. She wasn't clinging to optimism. She was holding on to loyalty, to Naomi, to a woman just as bitter and broken as she was, to a faith she barely understood. That moment defies logic. She had every reason to walk away, every excuse to protect herself, but she didn't. She leaned into something deeper, something sacred. She chose presence over escape. And let's be real, how many of us, when we lose everything, instinctively grasp for the exit? We want a way out, a quick fix, a new identity, anything to not sit in the ache of it all. But Ruth? She walks into the unknown, into the discomfort, into the slow, painful process of starting over. No guarantees, no applause, just grit and grace. Psychologists who study resilience often talk about something called post-traumatic growth. The idea that while trauma breaks us, it can also become the soil where something unexpected begins to grow. Not in spite of the pain, but because of what the pain reveals about what matters most. Ruth wasn't chasing legacy. She was just doing the next right thing in the dark. Waking up, working the fields, picking up scraps to survive. And yet, in that field of grief and labor, redemption was already moving toward her. Boaz didn't just find her, he noticed her. Her kindness, her faithfulness, her quiet courage. And through that connection, through her consistent, unspectacular faithfulness, Ruth became part of something bigger than she ever imagined. Not just a love story, not just provision. She became the great-grandmother of King David and part of the lineage of Jesus. That's not just poetic. That's divine design through ordinary days. So here's what I want to say to the woman who feels like her life has been stripped bare, who feels like she's just surviving in the ruins of what once was. Maybe this isn't your ending. Maybe this is the field where your future begins. Maybe you don't have to understand the plan. Maybe you just need to keep showing up, even when it's mundane, even when it's messy, even when it hurts. Sometimes your next chapter starts in a field of loss, but ends in a legacy of redemption. That's what Ruth's story whispers to us. That the quiet decisions, the loyal choices, the seemingly small acts of faithfulness, they matter more than we think. You're not forgotten in your grief. You're not invisible in your uncertainty. You are walking the kind of path that heaven writes history with, one field at a time, one brave step at a time. There was a time in my life when I looked around and saw leaders, speakers, visionaries, and I thought to myself, I could never be one of them. I had a voice, sure. I had passion, but I also had anxiety. I doubted myself, I overanalyzed every word I said, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if people really saw how messy, uncertain, and flawed I was on the inside, they'd never take me seriously. So I stayed small, I stayed safe. And yet, deep down there was this quiet ache. I want to be bold, I just don't know how to be that kind of woman. Then I started noticing something in Scripture. Something that changed everything for me. The women God used most weren't polished. They weren't perfect. They weren't always the most obvious choice. In fact, they were often the ones least likely to be picked. Take Deborah, a prophetess, a judge. In a time when leadership belonged almost exclusively to men, Deborah sat under a palm tree, listening, discerning, delivering justice with clarity and confidence. But she didn't just lead, she sang. After victory, she lifted her voice in poetic praise. She embodied the kind of authority that doesn't dominate, it inspires. She was a leader with empathy, wisdom, and rhythm. Or Jael, who wasn't even a soldier, she was a homemaker, a tent dweller. And yet, when the opportunity came to take down a tyrant, she didn't wait for someone more qualified. She drove the stake through the enemy's head with her own two hands. Brutal, yes, but also incredibly brave. She used what was in her reach, tools from her everyday world, to fight a battle others feared. And then there's Mary Magdalene. For years, all anyone saw in her was her demons, 7 of them to be exact. But Jesus didn't define her by her torment. He healed her. And not only did she follow him, she stayed when others ran. When Jesus hung dying, most of the disciples scattered, but Mary stayed. And after the resurrection, she was the first to see him, the first to be sent. The first preacher of the gospel was a formerly broken woman. Let that sink in. The Samaritan woman. 5 husbands, 1 live-in situation, social outcasts. She met Jesus by a well, and he named her Truth. Not to shame her, but to free her. And she ran back to town declaring, "Come meet the man who told me everything I ever did." And the whole village came to believe because of her testimony. And then Mary, the mother of Jesus, a teenager, probably terrified, definitely underqualified. And yet when the angel spoke, she didn't ask for a resume. She didn't demand a plan. She just said, "Let it be unto me." Her yes changed eternity. And what do all these women have in common? They didn't wait to be fearless. They didn't wait to be perfect. They said yes, as they were, in their mess, in their questions, in their trembling. Psychologists talk about imposter syndrome, this internal experience of believing you're not as competent as others perceive you to be. And you know who it disproportionately affects? Women, especially high-achieving women. Especially women who step into roles traditionally held by men. We question ourselves constantly, convinced that one wrong move will expose us as frauds. But these biblical women, they remind me that calling was never about having it all together. It's about availability. It's about presence. It's about willingness. You may not feel like a leader, but if you've ever stood beside someone in pain and offered kindness, you've led. You may not hold a microphone, but if you've spoken the truth when it cost you something, you've preached. You may not feel brave, but if you've kept going through heartbreak, disappointment, or fear, you've already done the bravest thing of all. There is no right way to be a woman of faith. You don't have to fit someone else's mold. You don't need louder words or shinier accomplishments. You need honesty, grit, and a heart willing to say yes. You don't need to wait for permission to be the woman God already called. You are already chosen. You are already equipped, even in your weakness. And just like Deborah, Mary, Ruth, Jael, and the Samaritan woman, Your story isn't a side note. Your story isn't a side out. It's part of the revolution God is writing through ordinary, broken, bold women who dare to say, "Here I am, Lord. Use me." That includes you, especially you. You don't have to be fearless to be faithful. You don't have to have it all together to be used by God. These 12 women weren't remembered because they were flawless. They were remembered because they were willing. Daring doesn't always look like shouting from a stage. Sometimes it looks like whispering yes in the dark. So if you're standing on the edge of doubt, identity, or fear, I want you to know you come from a long line of daring women. You are not the first to shake, but you might be the first in your family to rise.